an overview of Chronicles, and this is very similar to the Samuel and Kings overviews we've done the last couple of weeks, where in our English Bibles you have 1st and 2nd Chronicles as two different books, but it really is one work in the Hebrew Bible. And so that's the explanation for that once again. These are the only three. Well, Shad probably has a couple left over. That's all I printed. Okay. And so these are the only three books in the Old Testament. We have 1st and 2nd. And in the Hebrew Bible, there's not such a thing. It's just Samuel and then Kings and then Chronicles. And so we're treating 1st and 2nd Chronicles in our English Bibles as one overview today. Now, there is now a lot of overlap. So I sometimes think of how you have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John in the New Testament, and there's a lot of overlap. There's a lot of the same historical events that are recorded in those. And that's the way it is with Chronicles. When you read the book of Chronicles, you're going to read a lot of the same events that are the subject matter that you read in Samuel and Kings. The reigns of the kings, a special emphasis on David and Solomon. But of course, it's written with a different emphasis. It's written and recorded for a different reason. And so on the notes, now that you have the notes, it says, though the book of Chronicles covers the same historical period as Samuel and Kings, there is a different literary emphasis. So there's a different reason why it's written. Samuel and Kings focuses on the people and kings of Israel. I'd probably put prophets and kings of Israel there. But Chronicles focuses primarily on the role of the temple and priesthood in Jerusalem. So there's a lot of focus on the city of Jerusalem and the temple that's there and the priesthood services that are to be conducted there. And because this is, as it says, the life and prosperity of the nation. The life and prosperity of the nation is dependent upon the faithfulness of Israel to the law of God in the temple as his house or as his center of worship. And so I have there little letter A. Kings was written to a people in exile. So we talked about that. In fact, the last of the books of Kings records the destruction of Jerusalem. And the Commonwealth of Israel was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar, and they were carried into captivity. And so the book of Kings was written then to explain to them why they were in exile, right? That's what the rest of that says, to explain why they were there. But in contrast to that, Chronicles was written probably by Ezra. We don't know for sure, it doesn't say, but we have reasons to believe this. But when did Ezra live? After the exile, when God was bringing everybody back to the land, back to Canaan land, right? So Chronicles was written probably by Ezra to the people who had returned from exile. They're back in the land, and they had to rebuild and restore what? The temple. And they had to restore the worship in the temple, the national worship of Yahweh, the true God of heaven. So Ezra would write the book of Chronicles, is probably the best theory to go off of, in order to encourage the people to remember their history and to remember not only the glory of having God's house there in Jerusalem, but the blessings attendant of faithfulness to him, and how that he wants to bless his people by dwelling in their midst if they will have it. So it's important to remember your history. History has great lessons, and you don't want to erase it by tearing down all of the memories, the memorials, statues, and all of that. There is a reason for it. History is unfolded on a linear timeline according to God, and we would do well to remember it. And here the great glory is, this is where God lives. This is where God's house is, and it's a great privilege to be able to live where God dwells. He wants to do this, and that way you're living closely to him obediently to him, and he will bless you in that way. But with the period of the Chronicles, when it was written, that had been destroyed, but now Ezra and Nehemiah and these other leaders are saying, let's rebuild. Let's put it all back together and let God continue to work out his plan among us. And so that's why Chronicles was written, to remind them. Why? General idea of understanding the basic thrust of Chronicles. Now, I have at number 2 an outline, not in great detail or anything, but there's a similar idea here that we looked at the last couple of books. But the first 9 chapters of each book has a significant point, and then the rest of the chapters of each book have their significant point. First Chronicles, chapters 1 through 9. This is a great chronicling or genealogical record of the history of God's people. Seed line through which he is going to bring in a nation, and the nation through which he's going to bring in the one Savior of the world. So you can see the book of Chronicles begins with the word Adam. It's a genealogy that goes all the way back to the first man, Adam, and then into Seth and Enosh and Cainan and Mahalalel. So that's your genealogies you can read in Genesis 5, and then it goes on to Genesis 7, and it gets into Noah and his sons. And so if you're just going to start off in reading Chronicles, it's going to be a little boring there at first, because you're just going to read a whole lot of names. But then it's going to start branching. The Bible, but the nation of Israel is the book of Genesis, where the promises were made to Abraham, and then through him, just because he was Abraham and he had grandchildren, those grandchildren were going to be blessed in unique ways, but none greater than through Isaac. Why? This, of course, is 1 Chronicles 1:34 and following. Isaac was the special son of promise, and it was through him that God was then going to create a nation, and that goes into chapter 2, the nation of Israel, through Isaac and his son Jacob, and then all of the tribes of Israel. But instead of all the tribes being further elaborated upon, they're just mentioned in verses 1 and 2, but it goes to verse 3, to the sons of who? Are y'all with me? So why just focus on the sons of Judah? Because that's the tribe through whom the special seed was coming. So you can see where Chronicles is going. It's trying to narrow all of this down to the king of Israel, that is in charge of exalting the law of God in Jerusalem, so that the temple services, the priesthood, and all are to operate according to the law. Of who was the big family? So it was man through Adam and Eve. It was the nation through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It was the tribe through Judah. And it was the family through which family in Judah? Through which person? David. Chapter 3 and verse 1. Now these were the sons of David who were born to him in Hebron. So this is how the first 9 chapters unfolds. And it begins to describe the central place that Judah, with David as the king, served. So that's another way to see the difference in the Kings and the Chronicles. The kings, the northern 10, often called Israel, and the southern 2, often just referred to as Judah. Chronicles does mention the kings of the north, but really only to say, see, they have remained in apostasy unceasingly. But it's Judah that God is restoring. And so Judah is the central focus of Chronicles. So the people of God in general, but it narrows to David, and that starts in chapter 10, chapters 10 through 29 on your outline. That focuses on David's own dynasty and the divinely revealed plan. Material is alluded to, if not covered in some detail, in 1st and 2nd Samuel, as we looked at. David growing his army whenever he was kind of in exile, because Saul was the actual king at the time. But David, of course, eventually becomes king, And by 1 Chronicles chapter 17, you have that special covenant that's mentioned. We often usually say 2 Samuel 7. That's what's pounded into our minds, which is fine. But the parallel to that is 1 Chronicles 17. That's where God enters into that covenant with David, and it's recorded there with those emphases there. It goes all the way back to Adam, and it ends with a grand explanation of David's reign because of the central feature of that covenant made between God and David and his offspring. The rest of 1 Chronicles, so basically the chapters that are in the 20s, are all dealing with David's plans to build the temple. Now, if you remember, David himself wanted to be the king that oversaw the building of the temple, but that was the whole point that Nathan came to him and said, no, God says, I don't want you to oversee the building of the temple. It's going to be your son. And Solomon would be the immediate plans for it. God said, okay, but when it does come to be built, here are the plans. Basically, some blueprints given. Some details about the services of the temple were given by God to David, and then David gave them to his son Solomon. So are you seeing, you don't get that information in Kings and in the Samuel and Kings. But Chronicles, probably Ezra, focuses on that because this is what those returnees need to hear. They need to hear, listen, now everything about the temple was detailed given by God to David. And then David gave them to Solomon. I just want to read a couple of passages so you can get the flavor of that. In 1 Chronicles 28, beginning in verse 9, here's David's speech to Solomon before David died. Or part of it at least. My son Solomon, know the God of your father and serve him with a loyal heart and with a willing mind, because the Lord, or the Greek, the Hebrew is Yahweh there, the true God of heaven. Yahweh searches all hearts and understands all the intent of the thoughts. If you seek him, he will be found by you. If you forsake him, he will cast you off forever. Consider now, for the Lord has chosen you to build a house for the sanctuary. Be strong. To his son Solomon. Again, you don't get this information in those earlier books. Then David gave his son Solomon the plans for the vestibule, its houses, its treasuries, its upper chambers, its inner chambers, the place of the mercy seat, and the plans for all that he had by the Spirit, of the courts of the house of the Lord, all the chambers all around, the treasuries of the house of God, the treasuries for the dedication of the Lord, for all the articles of service in the house of the Lord, and all of the details. You see that? Now that's important. I know it seems maybe boring just to read it if you don't understand the emphasis here. But Ezra is trying to get Israel to realize, listen, you're not just coming back to start your own economy and try to get your families back in order. It's all about fulfilling the will of the Lord, restoring the temple and the law and the priesthood so that God can send Messiah to bless the world. That's huge. And so that's just a kind of a quick way of reading through that to get the point of why 1 Chronicles was written by Ezra in such a way. And then when he gets into 2 Chronicles, he picks up with Solomon taking those plans after the death of his father David and being strong and doing it as David told him to do. So on your outline you see letter C. 2 Chronicles 1 through 9 is the building of this glorious temple by Solomon. So those first 9 chapters records all of that. In fact, by the end of chapter 9, you have the death of Solomon recorded. And all of that, but Chronicles focuses more about the fate of the temple. The fate of the temple. I don't really know about how much to get into as far as the details of the building of the temple. We talked a little bit about this when we looked at the book of Kings. You can look at chapter 3, verse 1 of 2 Chronicles, and it just says, now Solomon began to build the house of David at the very place that David had prepared on the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite. He began to build on the second day of the second month, the fourth year of his reign. And then it begins to describe many of the details and the completion of it, the dedication of it. So Solomon gives this amazing speech and prayer that he offers when the temple was completed and dedicated and the glory of the Lord filled the temple. This is all chapter 6. Fire came down from heaven and consumed the burnt offerings and the sacrifices, and the glory of the Lord filled the temple. The priest could not even enter the house of the Lord because the glory of the Lord had filled the Lord's house. So it's done. Solomon did according to David's plans, and the temple was established. So again, Ezra is writing this saying, this is your tradition. This is your history. You need to now rebuild the temple and get it going again. Now, we'll probably have more reason to mention this when we look at Ezra and Nehemiah and those books. But if you remember, Ezra oversaw the rest of that, but the glory of the Lord never returned. So that's an interesting thing because, it's emphasized here that when Solomon finished, God came miraculously and appeared in the smoke and the clouds and things like this. But whenever it was rebuilt in the days of, the restoration, there was no miraculous manifestation. And oftentimes it says the people would weep. They would see this temple and they say, this does not compare to what Solomon builds in comparison. But interestingly, I don't know how much to get into this, but anyway, the point I'm driving at is the New Testament says, but the Lord did come to his temple. But it was the ultimate temple. It was his church, his body. And we today are the ultimate temple, and God dwells in his church. And the glory is there. And so Jesus did appear in person as a man, and he lived among the people of Israel. And the irony is they didn't recognize him because, of course, he was veiled in flesh. He didn't come in glory like he did in the days of Solomon when the temple was done. He came in flesh, and he looked like a lowly pauper. He was a carpenter, and he wasn't in glorious robes and all of that, or fire or smoke. But he was glorious nonetheless. But it was in the resurrection when he appeared to his disciples, and they went out with that message and established the church, that the Lord entered his temple in that sense and dwells among him. But he related the history that we read in the book of Chronicles. This is why it's kind of, it's very helpful to get the flavor for what God's Word is trying to tell us, to envision and to understand that your history matters and that God is the Lord of history and that the history is not done. The New Testament isn't over in that sense, right? That we're in the new covenant, lowly, a humble state where no glory is seen, but in ultimate glory. Every eye shall see him and every tongue confess. And those who, rejected him will mourn and weep because they will see the true glory of Jesus. And so he will come. He dwells in his people in the church today, but he will come and dwell in a direct way, Revelation 21, with the people of God in the New Jerusalem in a most direct way. And it's all still part of history. But in the meantime, the book of and the deterioration of the kingdom. And so that's the rest of the book of 2 Chronicles, from 2 Chronicles 10 all the way through chapter 36. It's a really long book because it records several years of history. There is desecration of the temple. Oftentimes there's either just neglect of the priesthood and the proper roles, or there is introduction of idolatry. But either way, it's desecrated. And I have here, there are short restorations. And this is just recorded, you read through this flow of 2 Chronicles, and then pretty soon you get this little spark of light when Jehoshaphat or Josiah or somebody restores some element of the temple worship and Lord when this happens. And so we've even talked about the restoration plea that we think is legitimate and appropriate and necessary. But in the end, it says here, there's the final destruction. The destruction of that temple that Solomon built. I say here under that, the kings of Judah are all depicted with primary emphasis on their relationship and attitude toward the temple and its services. So that's what's going to be at the center, is Ezra's trying to say, okay, let's talk about this king. What was his attitude toward the Jerusalem cultus, the temple and the ritual worship of the priests? Did they uphold these things? Because that's what honors God. And that's the Asa, Jehoshaphat, Joash, Uzziah, Jotham, Hezekiah, and Josiah, though some of them were mixed bags. It is said these did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. So, in what way? In restoring or emphasizing or keeping pure the temple and the worship there. And I have some verses there you could read, but we don't have time. Except to point out the severity of their apostasy from the faith. And the importance of true temple worship in Jerusalem only. So those 10 tribes were already cut off from Jerusalem because of their geography, and that's why they followed Jeroboam in the times and places. There's more emphasis on priests in the books of Chronicles than on prophets compared to the book of Kings, though prophets do have their role, obviously. And then I have here the final destruction. This is in the middle of your outline, number 3. The final destruction of the temple is depicted as God's own wrath. So it's not just that, some foreign king overpowered Israel. It's God sent them. God was orchestrating this as a punishment on his sinful nation. So though the temple had been central to the writer, the point has been made clear since Solomon that God is too great to be confined to a physical structure. So the question, of course, arose into captivity. Does that mean that God himself has been negatively affected? Well, no. Solomon himself said, heaven of heavens cannot contain you, much less this house that I have built here in Jerusalem. So we know that God is greater than that, but this was his way of working in flow of human history with this nation. So I have here, of course, the implication for us today is to remember heartfelt devotion and obedience is necessary if we're going to enjoy God's continued fellowship. Even the Israelites who remained faithful could still be in fellowship with God even if the temple was destroyed. When we think of Ezekiel over in captivity or Daniel, these are faithful prophets. So they didn't lose their salvation because the temple was destroyed. This was a temporal national destruction of the people as a whole because of the apostasy on a national scale. So the same thing here. God will judge you individually. You won't be judged based upon how devotion and your faithfulness and your willingness to be used by God in his service. Now, it's a blessing to be a part of this congregation. It's a great blessing to be a part of a group of God's people that love one another and love the Lord. That should help us to be even more faithful and to rejoice. But it's not necessary in order for you to be faithful. You can be a part of a congregation that has some brethren you can strive to influence for good. And that's what I think the idea of this point is. And so the implication, I think, for the returnees that Ezra is writing to is that God will rebuild the temple now through their repentance and restoration. What can you do to restore what is broken down? We all have a role that we can fulfill.
I thought this is like a discussion time.
Yeah, go right ahead. I'm tired of listening to myself too.
The other day, we talked about it in the young folks Bible classes, is the one really that struck the rock and didn't just speak to it. It doesn't say that Aaron did any of that, but God spoke to Moses and Aaron about what they should do. And Aaron kind of was along there with Moses and didn't correct him, and kind of went along with it. And so Griffin, I think, asked, well, so did Aaron get punished? But he didn't strike the rock.
Right.
And so you're talking about the kind of congregation. We're also responsible, though, to, if we're in a congregation that's doing things that are against God's will, to remove ourselves from that congregation, because that will affect our salvation. I just want to point that out.
Yeah.
It does matter where you belong as a member.
Right.
Not every place with a sign on the front that says Church of Christ
Right.
is acceptable in God's eyes. And we
I agree with that. And I would only encourage us to think about it in terms also of cultural. So in the first century, you live in Ephesus, or say Colossae, maybe a smaller town. There's a congregation there. And something goes wrong, you can't just say, well, I'm going to start worshiping, get in my car and drive 15 miles and worship somewhere else. So it's just a different situation. Today it's much easier. But perhaps in some ways that could be to improve some things, one way or the other. But I'm just saying there is a little bit of a different cultural situation. That I don't know of any time in the past where you had the kind of transportation opportunities that you have today, to be able to. We have brethren here who drive 30 minutes sometimes, from 30 miles away or 40 miles away. And it's a blessing to us for sure here. But I'm just saying it wasn't always possible. In fact, it was rarely possible to do that. But I do agree with you that you can't be a part of a place that, you go to worship and you do it unscripturally. And you do it in a way that is, violation of God's will. In that case, you have to worship the congregation. As bad as that sounds to say just like that. But that's a good point. I do appreciate that. But as far as the way this plays out with Ezra writing here to these returnees, he's saying, listen, it's clear what's broken down. And we need, after the original part of the temple was restored years earlier under Zerubbabel and Joshua, but he was part of the overall restoration. He restored the law. He restored the temple services in the right order for the priest to begin ministering there again. So it's all part of the temple restoration. But that's right. So yeah, and if anybody has any comments or questions, feel free to raise your hand or speak up or whatever. So sorry, I get droning on and I kind of forget about making that clear. Okay, now here is, I don't know how important it is to you, but to me I found it fascinating. And it shows another facet of God's amazing, meticulous providence in history and how this all unfolds. Because when the destruction of the city and the temple is recorded in the last chapter of this book, 2 Chronicles, most bad, some good, but all overall it was a deterioration until finally God sends the king of the Chaldeans. The Chaldeans were the Babylonians, right? We say Babylon today, but it was Chaldea. In the last chapter, 2 Chronicles 36 and verse 17, with the sword in the house of their sanctuary. See, there's always some emphasis about the temple. And this is another desecration. You don't fight wars in the temple. But here, God's own people are getting slayed in the temple. In the house of their sanctuary, and had no compassion on young man or virgin, on the aged or the weak. He gave them all into his hand, and all the articles from the house of God, great and small, treasures of the house of the Lord, treasures of the king and his leaders, and all of these the king of Babylon took to Babylon. Then they burned the house with all its precious possessions. And those who escaped from the sword he carried away into Babylon, where they became servants to him and his sons until the rule of the kingdom of Persia, to do what? Next verse. To fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, until the land had enjoyed her Sabbaths. Now, that's a little bit cryptic if you're not familiar with what Jeremiah said, if you're not familiar with what's being said here. Now, how did that unfold? Because God had put in the law of Moses that there were to be not only Sabbath days, Sabbath years. Not just every seventh day of the week was a day of rest, but every seventh year was to be a Sabbath year. So you don't plant in your fields and you don't reap from your fields. God will bless you the years before that so you can store up and let the land rest every seventh year. That's kind of fascinating to think about. But you can read about that in Leviticus 25, 1 and following. But it just says, Jeremiah made a prediction in his days, which wasn't too far before the captivity. He said, God says he's going to send you into captivity to fulfill 70 years. They're going to be in captivity 70 years. And what we're learning here is that that was 70 Sabbath years. Now think about this. If a Sabbath year came about every 7 years, and you owed God 70 of those, how many years had transpired? 490, right? 70 times 7. To the day that God sent them out of the land had been 490 years. And Jeremiah said, you're going to be in that land for 70 years. For each Sabbath year, you did not obey the Sabbath year. Okay? So 70 years, he kind of crowded them all in one block, saying this was to fulfill the word of the Lord through Jeremiah until the land had enjoyed her Sabbaths. As long as she lay desolate, she kept Sabbath to fulfill 70 years. So they were in captivity exactly 70 years. I don't know if I have those years exactly on here, but when they first were carried off, the first deportation was 606 BC. That's when Daniel was carried over as a teenager, if you remember. And then Daniel, 70 years later, recorded in Daniel 9, he was reading Jeremiah. And it says that he read in Jeremiah that God was going to fulfill 70 years of captivity. Daniel just looks on the calendar and says, wait, we've been here 70 years. We're about to go home. God's about to send us home. And so he offers that great prayer in Daniel 9. And just, you got to turn there. This is too good. I don't care if you don't want to or not. Just turn there. So Daniel 9, he records this great prayer about, God, please bring us back, because now your time frame is ready. You are a God of precision, and I believe it, and we're going to be going home. And then it says, my people Israel, and presenting my supplication before the Lord my God, for the holy mountain of my God. Yes, while I was speaking in prayer, the man, and here without having to explain it, that's an angel here. The angel Gabriel, or the man Gabriel, he looked like a man, whom I had seen in a vision at the beginning, being caused to fly swiftly, reached me about the time of the evening sacrifice. And he informed me. And he talked with me, and he said, O Daniel, I have now come forth to give you skill to understand that at the very beginning of your supplications the command went out, and I have come to tell you, because you're greatly beloved, therefore, consider the matter and understand this vision. What does it say? 70 weeks are determined for your people and for your holy city. Now, what is being said here is, the word is weeks, right? The word is weeks, is all that's meant there. 7 what? I would encourage you to consider it 70 Sabbath years. 490 years is what's being said here. And from here we get what we call Daniel's prophecy of the 70 weeks. Now here's the payload of this. Daniel, in reading the book of Jeremiah, was reminded of the history of Israel 490 years in the past, wasn't he? And then whenever he prays to be returned to the land in order to continue the plan of God, Gabriel gives him a plan to bring in Messiah and offer eternal redemption in 490 years. And we have gone through in other classes some details about how this unfolds, about in so many years this is going to happen, and in so many years this is going to, and then Messiah is going to come. He's going to show up. And then he's going to be, for 1 week, he's going to be establishing the new covenant. In the middle of that week, he's going to be cut off. And so 3.5 years into Jesus' ministry, he was crucified. 3.5 years after that, the gospel went out from Jerusalem, from the whole, utterly destroyed. I don't know how much that is interesting to you, but it is extremely interesting to me, just because I just believe that what you have here is God showing how meticulous his providence can be. He doesn't leave anything up to chance. His foreknowledge, his omniscience, is able to orchestrate the conditions by which he can use free people like you and me to accomplish his purposes. He leaves the decision up to you and me, but he already knows what decision we're going to make. And so make the right decision and be a part of the solution rather than part of the problem. And so we read this beginning, this Sabbath year idea in 2 Chronicles chapter 36. And I just covered all under number 4 there. on your outline, though I didn't read much of it, but that's what I just said. So if you want to read it and make sure that's... Well, and those three words, I think, is one of the main things. And the deeper we can understand this truth, the better off we'll all be. God is faithful. God is faithful. He cannot make a promise that He won't fulfill. And He's promised us a lot of things. And it's just dependent on us to believe those promises and to trust in them and then to conform our lives to them. And He has established His eternal throne. So that great covenant that He promised David in 1 Chronicles 17 has come to pass already. And He has established an unshakable temple. Hasn't He? I don't have it here, but it's Hebrews chapter 12, isn't it? Beginning in verse 25, where the Hebrews writer tells the Christians there, "See that you do not refuse Him who speaks," that is God. "Because if they didn't escape who refused Him who spoke while on earth, how much more shall we not escape if we turn away from Him who speaks from heaven? Whose voice then shook the earth, but now He has promised, saying, Yet once more I will shake not only the earth, but also the heaven." And this, yet once more, indicates that He is going to remove every creation, right? The things which cannot be shaken will remain. And so the application here is verse 28. We, Christians, are receiving a kingdom which cannot be shaken. So let us have grace by which we might serve God acceptably with reverence and godly fear, because our God is a consuming fire. He consumed Jerusalem and the temple in the Old Testament, and He will consume the world of rebellion and sin and death when He returns, so that the things that cannot be shaken may remain. And we are part of a kingdom that cannot be shaken. As a head for the church. The church is the true temple of God, and there are some verses that say exactly that. 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 5 and 9. And Ephesians 2, 19 through 22 says Jesus is the cornerstone by which the whole temple is constructed, and we are individual stones that build that temple, and God dwells in that temple by means of the Holy Spirit in the law of Christ will preserve it and will allow continual fellowship with God in it. And so when we disregard Christianity and walk in our own ways, well, just like David cried out, "Lord, don't take your Holy Spirit from me," He will depart because you have walked away from Him and you're not in fellowship with Him anymore. But if you are faithful, if you're in the church and you're striving for faithfulness, you will have continual fellowship with God no matter where you are in the world. He's not confined to one location. Message, the application, I think, the pay dirt of what we want to glean from a study of the book of Chronicles. So, anyway, hopefully that's helpful, and I appreciate your attention this afternoon. So we'll have a final, it'll be interesting when we get into Ezra next week, because if you'll notice, the first few verses of Ezra are the last few verses of Chronicles. So that's one of the reasons why we believe Ezra wrote Chronicles, but it's verbatim, so he's like vacation. So we'll have a final song and a final prayer, be dismissed for the rest of the day. Great to see you all this afternoon.